Helman Ghorst peered out from below his blackened hood and looked down the length of the valley below. From his vantage point atop the mountain to the southwest of Tempelhof, he could clearly see the approach of the Empire's hunting party from the north. Helman had no doubt that the impending force was just the newest front of Alberich von Corden's relentless campaign to purge Sylvania of the undead. Even thinking the witch hunter's name sent a wave of rage coursing through Helman's wretched frame. Helman glanced behind him at his cart. There were the remains of a meagre 24 bodies piled upon his hellish vehicle. That would not be enough to destroy the witch hunter's raiding party. Whilst he was an adept necromancer, in order to overcome the impending army, Helman would need access to a lot more raw materials than that. Leaping into the back of his cart, Helman grabbed his whip and lashed out at the 4 zombies drawing his ramshackle ride. If he could reach Tempelhof in time, Helman knew where there would be enough bodies to muster a sufficient counterattack. Despite having long ago grown accustomed to death and the use of cadavers in his magic, the thought of what he was about to do brought back painful memories for Helman, and with it, a customary shiver down his spine. Helman would need to reach the village as soon as possible, but, given that he was being drawn along by 4 zombies, who were not renowned for being the quickest of creatures, he allowed his mind to wander back to his youth, and the first time he had ridden the path from the mountains down into Tempelhof. The Ghorst family were the best farriers and grooms in the region. Helman and Helga Ghorst had spent their lives building up the family business. Helman would shoe and tend to the horses, and Helga would teach the children of Tempelhof to ride. It was a happy home, made all the brighter by the arrival of the Ghorst children. The first child was Telman, who was then followed by Felman, Velman, and Derek. Helman ensured that his children were used to working with horses from a young age, so that when he died, his sons could jointly take over the family business. That was until the sickly Helman was born. "Remember to remain calm, Helman. If you're anxious, the horse will never trust you, and you will never learn to control it. Look how Norman's mount is responding to his commands. That is because he feels comfortable on his horse." Having been a weak child, his mother had not taken Helman riding before. His first lesson, being on the day of his 17th birthday, meant that his 4 older brothers had each been taught to ride at least a decade earlier than Helman. But, at last, his mother decided it was time to get her youngest son into the saddle. Helman just didn't understand why he had to be taught at the same time as Norman, the irritating 10-year-old from Tempelhof. Helman tried to relax, but, despite his mother's kind words of encouragement, he could not shake his sense of unease. "Perhaps if I ride out in front of you, your horse will follow my lead and calm down," said Norman in a tone that Helman was certain was meant to irritate him. Helga agreed and allowed the 2 youngsters to ride on ahead. As she watched her son trotting away, Helga was blissfully unaware of her impending doom. To the north of Tempelhof lay the dire forest. It was rare for any of the wolves from the woods to venture this far south, and yet, from atop a nearby outcrop of rocks, the wolf lay, observing the 3 riders. Once the 2 children had ridden ahead, the wolf decided to strike. It leapt from its lofty hiding place a mere 10 yards in front of Helga. The sudden appearance of the wolf startled her horse. It reared onto its hind legs before bolting away up the mountain. Helga was flung from the saddle with a scream. The wolf had set its sights on the horse, and was soon in hot pursuit up the mountain. Unfortunately, it was already too late for Helga. Her neck had been broken when she was flung from her steed, and she was killed instantaneously. Helman was devastated by the death of his mother. She had provided him with constant love and attention growing up to compensate for the fact that he was too weak to help his older brothers around the stables. As the weeks after Helga's untimely demise passed, it became apparent that Helman and his 4 eldest sons all blamed Helman for his mother's death. With half of the family's income stream now gone, the family Ghorst fell upon hard times. Despite their financial difficulties, his brothers and father's resentment towards Helman caused them to refuse his help around the stables, and they confined him to the family home and household tasks. 6 months to the day after his mother's death, a mysterious stranger visited the Ghorst stables, looking for some assistance. Looking from the kitchen window, Helman saw the debased-looking character lean his tall, odd-looking staff against the stable wall, before shaking hands with his father and 4 older brothers. Helman decided that the oddest thing about this man was the skull he carried with him, which seemed to have a faint blue glow emanating from its sockets. After a lengthy discussion, the stranger departed, and the Ghorst brothers returned to the house. "Who was that?" asked Helman, as his siblings returned. "He said his name was Lewis," explained Helman. "He is looking for someone to take a cart south to Vargavia, in order to pick up a delivery of wine, beer, rehypnol, sweetmeats, some little blue tablets, tablecloths, and candles. He's opening some sort of tavern and needs supplies. Look, Helman, we're all too busy to go on this journey, but we can't afford to miss out on any paid work at the minute. You'll have to go for us." Helman had little choice, and so his brothers readied the family cart and sent him on his way. During his travels across Sylvania, Helman came across a number of villages that had been wiped out by some sort of plague. Upon reaching Vargravia, Helman obtained the requested supplies before finding a cheap inn to stay at for the night ahead of commencing his return journey. Whilst there, he asked the innkeeper about the plague-ridden villages he had seen on his trip. The innkeeper had heard rumour of an old man who had contracted so many diseases from his various conquests that his very touch could infect those he met with a terrible plague. It's probably an old wives' tale, but they say that the gods themselves have condemned the old lech to carry about a skull with glowing blue eyes as a warning about what his touch will Hey, come back! You haven't paid for your room! However, it was too late. Helman was already running back to his cart to get back to his family. Returning home, Helman ran to the door, only to find his way blocked by a large, imposing character. "Stop, sir! You cannot enter this abode. The inhabitants have been infected and killed by the blue plague, and there may be dangerous spores remaining in the premises." It appeared that this man was a doctor of some kind. Helman suspected that the breathing apparatus that the man wore over his face must have been to prevent him from inhaling any of the spores that could be present in the Ghorst home. "I don't care!" shouted Helman. "My family are in there. If they're all dead, then I would prefer to die with them." Helman pushed past the doctor and ran to the corpses of his father and brothers. Helman embraced his father and each of his siblings before lying down next to them and waiting for death to come. However, death would not take Helman Ghorst so easily. After several hours, the doctor returned and explained that he would need to take the bodies away to be disposed of in one of the newly dug plague pits. Helman protested and postured that if the bodies were a risk, then he would be dead by now. The doctor tried to argue with Helman, but eventually backed down once he agreed to sign a waiver, confirming that if any more people got infected, then he would be responsible for their deaths and held legally liable. "Do I just sign below where you signed there, Dr. Seabane, is it?" This was confirmed, and the bodies were left with a grief-stricken Helman. Helman could not accept that his family had all been taken from him. He knew that he ought to take the bodies of his father and brothers to the family mausoleum in order to let them rest alongside his mother, but he couldn't bring himself to do so. To take his family to the mausoleum would mean that they were really gone. Having sat staring at the cadavers of his family for over a week, Helman decided that he needed to do something about it. In his youth he had read the tales of the rise and fall of Nagash. He recalled that Nagash had come across a number of tribes who used Ebony Cat, or Godstone, to bring life back to their fallen tribesmen. Helman didn't know where he would be able to find any Godstone, but he did have an idea about who might be able to help him. There were tales of a knowledgeable old monster who lived deep in the dire forest. If anybody was able to help Helman, it would be him. Helman gathered the family's last remaining warbucks and set off into the woods. After several days' travelling, he finally came across a quaint little cottage in the centre of a clearing. This had to be the place. Helman knocked on the front door and was greeted by the biggest person he had ever seen. Oh, the horror, thought Helman whilst trying to remain calm. The creature before him had huge spiny bones protruding from his hunched back, an immeasurable number of scars and boils covering his skin, and drew behind him a huge club which was covered in dried blood. The most disconcerting thing about the creature, though, was the huge, friendly smile it wore across its comparatively small face. "Hello, I'm Igor. Would you like to come in for a nice cup of tea?" Helman explained his predicament, and explained that he was looking to find some Ebony Cat to bring his family back to life. Igor wasn't able to help him finding some Godstone, but he was able to give him a torn piece of parchment with a number of arcane drawings etched upon it. "This is a copy of one of the pages from Nagash's famous books. I wasn't able to translate the whole thing, but as far as I can tell, all you need to do is draw the ritual circle shown on the page and sacrifice as many cats as you can get your hands on." After promising to bring Igor the dead cats once he was done with them, Helman returned to Tempelhof. Upon his return, Helman set about gathering as many cats as he could steal from around the village. He made his final preparations and set his father's body at the centre of the ritual circle etched in the kitchen floor. Helman sacrificed the 12 cats he had managed to gather before there were any signs of success. With a start, Yelman's eyes shot open, and he emitted a terrible scream. The ritual had only served to partially reanimate Helman's father, who now seemed to be trapped in a perpetual cycle of pain and suffering. The screaming went on for hours with no sign of any further life coming back to his father. The experiment had failed. The sound of his father's pained scream only served to push Helman even further into insanity. Finally, he couldn't stand it any longer, and he grabbed a nearby frying pan with the intention of putting old Yelman out of his misery. As Helman raised his makeshift bludgeon above his head, he heard a sudden metallic clattering behind him. Helman turned to see Norman, the child from the village, looking into the kitchen in horror. a bucket of spilled oats strewn at his feet where he had dropped it. Norman broke out into a run back towards the village. Helman knew that when Norman reached Tempelhof, he would tell the authorities what he had seen, and Helman would be burned at the stake for his crimes. Such was the regime of terror that was being introduced by Alberic von Corden, the famed witch hunter of the Empire, who had been travelling Sylvania looking for the creature that had spread the plague that had brought so much devastation to the region. Helman knew that he had to escape. He started to prepare the family cart and gather supplies. Within an hour, though, Helman saw the faint glow of torches approaching from the village. He had to hide. Helman ran. There was only one place he could think of that none of the villagers would go near or think to look for him. As he approached the plague pit, the smell of decay began to overwhelm him. He knew that if he wanted to survive, he would have to hide amongst the bodies of those taken by the recent plague. Helman dug his way deep into the pit until he was sure he could not be seen. There must have been hundreds of bodies filling the pits, and as Helman stared into the cold, dead eyes of an old woman flung into the mass grave, he reflected on the fact that his life would never be the same again. Helman waited until nightfall before clambering out from amongst the dead. As he made his way towards his home, he saw smoke rising from the garden. The villagers had burnt the screaming body of his father before making their way across the fields towards the Ghorst family mausoleum to look for Helman. He knew he had little time before the villagers returned to his home. Helman thought that the villagers were more likely to notice if any of the treasured Ghorst horses were missing, so he quickly harnessed up the family's 2 oxen to the cart. Along with the sparse provisions he was able to gather, Helman loaded the bodies of his 4 brothers onto the cart. He would not let the villagers take them away from him as well. With that, Helman left Tempelhof and started on a journey that would keep him away from his home for many years to come. A sudden jolt brought Helman's focus back to the present. The right leg of one of the zombies drawing along his cart had fallen off and rolled under the wheel of his vehicle. Leaping from his perch on the back of the cart, Helman could see that the dismembered limb had been ruined as it rolled under the wheel. "If you weren't family, Helman Ghorst, I would have destroyed you a long time ago. Now pull yourself together," cried Herman as he strapped a piece of wood to the knee of his undead sibling. Helman regained his seat on top of the cart and whipped his 4 brothers back into their shambolic stagger towards the village. Helman could not afford any further delays if he were to reach the plague pit of Tempelhof in time. He had to muster a sufficient force to deal with the approaching Empire raiding party, and knew from his night spent hiding in the plague-ridden hole that there were hundreds of bodies awaiting reanimation. As his cart made its way down from the mountain, Helman wondered if he would make it in time to make the necessary preparations and raise enough zombies to deal with the impending force. Only time will tell.